Lisa, we invited Lisa Koop to join us. For those of you who are long-term members here, you know her. Others of you who've joined more recently may not, and so I asked her permission to read a paragraph that she provided to me. Lisa is the National Director of Legal Services at the National Immigration Justice Center, and I asked her to talk about that organization this morning in part. She directs NIJC's Asylum Project, handles federal litigation, and provides representation and supervision in deportation defense matters. Lisa specializes in litigation, policy, and direct services advocacy on behalf of immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. Lisa heads NIJC's Indiana offices and is an adjunct professor at Notre Dame Law School. Lisa is the daughter of Irene and Victor Koop, who just happened to be with us this morning. She is a child of CMC and retains connections to this wonderful church community. Thank you for that comment. Lisa graduated from Goshen College in 1999, after which she completed 2 years of Mennonite voluntary service in Harlingen, Texas, where she was first exposed to immigration law. Lisa returned to Indiana for law school, graduated magna cum laude from Indiana University McKinney School of Law in 2004. Lisa and her family moved to Goshen from Chicago in 2012. Lisa's husband, Breck Herbert, is a public school teacher at Concord Junior High. Her children, Eliza and Leo, are a rising junior and a rising freshman at Goshen High School. If I'm not mistaken, Eliza is a cross-country runner, am I right? Some of you may see her in the Goshen sports page occasionally. Lisa, thanks so much for being willing to join us. Welcome to Sojourners.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So good to see so many familiar faces, but also always intimidating to come and talk to this wonderful and scholarly and experienced and wise group. So thank you for letting me come and be with you today. Usually the way this works, Dell every so often sends me an email and asks to come and give an immigration update, which I'm always very happy to do. You all usually have many, many very good and insightful questions. So I come with a slideshow prepared, and we usually get a slide or two in before we're off and running on whatever topics or issues are of interest to you. And I think that tends to work really well. So I invite you to, as soon as questions strike you, start to raise them. I don't know if we have a mic to pass around or if I can share mine, but we'll make sure that everyone hears your questions. And we can kind of go whatever direction is of interest to you. But the assignment from Dell was to talk about national issues and local issues and try to tie those things together and give a bit of a current event update. So that's what I've tried to do. As Dell said, I work for the National Immigrant Justice Center. And as soon as my slides agree to move forward, we'll do that. Okay, well, while we wait for my computer to wake up, I can tell you about NAJC. NAJC, the National Immigrant Justice Center. I don't know why it's not doing that. All right, so the National Immigrant Justice Center, where I work, is a nonprofit organization that's based in Chicago. And we provide immigration legal services to immigrants, most of whom otherwise couldn't afford an attorney. So all of our clients are at or below 200% of the poverty line. And we're based in Chicago. We're about 160 people. We have offices in Goshen and Indianapolis, and a policy shop out in Washington, D.C., where we do policy work, and then some other projects throughout the country. So, for example, we have a team in San Diego that works more closely on some of the border issues that arise there. NIJC's approach to immigration legal advocacy is sort of three-pronged, and that makes us a little bit different from some organizations that focus exclusively on policy work, other groups that do exclusively direct services. We do both. So we try to do really high volume legal services, and we try to connect that with litigation and policy work. And when I say litigation, I'm referring to cases that we identify where we go into the federal courts and try to change the law more broadly. So, for example, a recent example of NIJC's three-pronged approach would be within the last year to 18 months, the Biden administration has really taken some measures to try to limit access to asylum. So asylum protection is a legal status that people can seek if they're afraid to return to their country of origin because they've experienced persecution or they fear persecution in the future on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. And there's a lot of conversation right now about immigrants, using asylum as a loophole, immigrants exploiting the asylum system. There's this very entrenched narrative that I would say is largely a false narrative that suggests that this practice of offering refugee status is somehow now misguided or no longer fits within what we should be doing in response to immigrants arriving in the United States. And one of the ways the Biden administration has tried to limit access to that asylum system is by using a statutory tool called expedited removal. Expedited removal is a process by which the government can stop someone really soon after they arrive in the United States, and they can deport them immediately, summarily, without them ever going before an immigration judge. Basically, you get detained, an immigration officer can figure out, oh, you don't have the proper documents to be here. You're going to get sent back to your country of origin, unless you can pass what's called a credible fear interview. So you have to establish even though I got to the United States maybe 3, 4, 5 days ago and I've been sitting in detention and I might be traumatized and I might be separated from my family, I'm going to go before an immigration official and I'm going to articulate that I somehow meet that definition of a refugee that I just described to you: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. And I'm going to show this officer I should be allowed to apply for asylum. That's called the credible fear process. If you pass that interview, then you don't get summarily deported. You get to be in regular deportation proceedings and you get to fight your case for asylum. So that begins the process of eventually having your day in court in order to seek asylum. What is happening now is an effort to limit the number of people that can pass that credible fear interview and get into the larger system. So what we've started to see at the border is, in addition to detaining people in private prisons, immigration detention centers, where typically many immigrants are held while they strive to overcome that expedited removal barrier, those credible fear interviews are starting to happen in CBP custody. So CBP is Customs and Border Protection. So that's the Border Patrol. Usually what happens at the border is one who is apprehended spends a very short amount of time in CBP custody before they're transferred to the ICE detention centers. And maybe jail is jail and detention is detention, but there are some pretty significant differences between remaining in CBP custody and Border Patrol custody and going into an ICE detention center. In CBP custody, there's zero access to attorneys. They don't let us into those facilities. We've tried. You can't talk to a lawyer about how you should present your case. Lawyers, we don't even know who's detained in CBP facilities, whereas in the ICE facilities at the detention centers, we can go in, do know your rights presentations and so forth, and hopefully equip people with information they need to pass that credible fear interview. In CBP custody, none of that happens. They're essentially dark sites. So we tried, in order to combat this, we set up a hotline where we took calls from people coming from CBP custody to be their lawyers. So my team, basically for a number of months, were on call almost 24/7 because these calls could come at any time, and we would talk to people that were in Border Patrol custody and say, okay, are you afraid of going back to your country of origin? We'd learn their story. We'd help them understand these are the things you can emphasize in your interview. We would submit notices of representation saying, hey, government, I'm the lawyer for this person. You have to call me when you do this interview with that person. They never called us, but they should have called us. And we tried to be the lawyers for people in CBP custody. Meanwhile, our advocacy people, our policy people were gathering all the data of what we were trying to do. And they were issuing reports saying, this is why this is really problematic. They were sounding the alarms. They were educating Congress people, and they were trying to get that practice to stop. And meanwhile, our litigation team was suing the government saying, hey, this practice, these additional barriers that you're putting up to seek asylum, those are really problematic. And we think that they fall out of line with what the statute requires in terms of our treatment of refugees. So that's sort of an NAJC approach, or an example of kind of the way we try to approach the immigration issues that we see. Now, we haven't stopped them from doing credible fear interviews in CBP custody. But we've certainly raised awareness about it. On the cases where we have been able to get involved, we've been able to get some people out of there, but that is still an ongoing real challenge in the system. And you'll hear today, as we talk, this theme of all of these efforts at play to really reduce access to asylum and to limit people's ability to even get to the starting line, even get to the point where they're submitting an application for asylum. So that's an example of the work that we do at NAJC. Here in Goshen, we are 6 people, 3 lawyers, 1 accredited representative, 2 paralegals. The work that we do is very similar to the work that big NAJC does in Chicago, but on a smaller scale. We have an active caseload of about 500 cases. I pulled that number. It was like, all right, we probably need to pump the brakes a little bit. That's a pretty busy caseload that keeps us, really working hard to stay on top of everything happening legally in our clients' cases. In Goshen, we really try to focus on asylum. So there are a lot of asylum seekers in our community. We try to focus on complex removal defense cases. So because we're an office that has lawyers, that has a lot of expertise, that has colleagues in Chicago that can help us cover court hearings, we sort of see our lane as doing the more complicated stuff, the litigation-related stuff, the asylum, the deportation defense. We're always concerned about ICE enforcement activity. So, for example, we took on a case, we're in court this last week, for a man who was placed in deportation proceedings when he showed up at a civil court process. So he'd had, it was like a small claims court judgment against him, and he went in to challenge that. And somehow ICE ended up taking him into custody and putting him in deportation proceedings. We're very concerned when ICE intersects with people who are just trying to go about their normal lives and places them in deportation proceedings. We have another client very recently out of South Bend who was placed in deportation proceedings because somebody hit her car. And the police officers that came, instead of taking a report and managing her complaint, asked her for her papers, determined that she has a complicated immigration history, and called ICE, and then called ICE and called ICE, because originally Immigration and Customs Enforcement had said, this isn't a priority case for us. But our local law enforcement was really determined to see her placed back into deportation proceedings. So that's another case. She's a nursing mother. She's a longtime community member. We were down in Indianapolis a few weeks ago, filing a stay of removal against ICE to keep her from being deported. And thankfully, my colleague was able to get her a stay for the next year, during which we'll work on filing for other legal relief to hopefully prevent her deportation. But this is why our caseload gets so big. These sorts of cases continue to arise, and it's awfully difficult to not get involved in those sorts of matters. But that's kind of the work that we do. Maybe I'll pause there if anyone has any questions before we kind of jump into some of the headlines that we're seeing these days.
What's an accredited representative?
So the question is, what's an accredited representative? Thank you for that question. So in the context of immigration law, somebody who is not a lawyer, but who works at a nonprofit organization and can establish that they've received sufficient training and has expertise, can function in many ways like an attorney. So in our office, Brittany Hirschberger has been a paralegal with us for going on 9 years, and has developed a lot of expertise. So we applied for her to be an accredited representative. And what that means is that she can file certain applications for people. She can make legal assessments. She's authorized to practice law. So when she goes out and, gives a legal presentation or files a form for someone, it's not the unauthorized practice of law. So it's a great opportunity to expand the capacity of nonprofit organizations if you can identify people for whom it makes sense to seek accredited status. Anything else?
Question I heard, and you can repeat it. How do you
how do you choose among, I mean, you must give even more.
Yeah, how do we choose among the cases that we take?
Can we have,
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So Dell's question is how do we decide which cases to take? And this is kind of the anguish of what we do, because there is always more capacity or more need than we have capacity to respond to. So we try to prioritize, we try to look for particularly vulnerable individuals. So we represent a lot of people that are extremely poor, that never had access to education. We try to identify people who maybe present some of the issues that we're particularly interested in litigating. We identify a lot of our cases through, in Chicago, we run an immigration court help desk. So people who show up at the Chicago Immigration Court and don't have a lawyer will often talk to us there. And those cases, our team in Chicago will refer to us, or we also have a hotline, a help desk hotline, where people call. And so we're doing some screening to try and identify the sorts of cases where we think we can really have an impact on an individual level. And also this is potentially a case through which we can expand the law more broadly. So one of the things that I do in my work is I litigate asylum cases in the Seventh Circuit. So the country's sliced up into a whole bunch of different courts of appeals. And here in Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, we're in the Seventh Circuit. And so we try to identify cases where we can get our court, the Seventh Circuit, to find, for example, that somebody who's been harmed because of their familial relationship, for example, is somebody who has a characteristic that might qualify them for asylum. And the Seventh Circuit has agreed with us on that, and they've issued 2 published decisions in cases that we've litigated that make that finding. So that means even for pro se people or people who are unrepresented who go to court without a lawyer, this law exists that hopefully helps them, even if we're not able to be there and be the lawyer for them before the immigration court. Yes.
What are some of the countries of origin in the Gresham area now?
Yeah, I mean, most of our clients are Spanish speaking. Our asylum seekers tend to be Central American, a lot of Salvadorans, Hondurans, some Guatemalans. Nicaragua has had all sorts of political upheaval in the last 5 or so years that has prompted a lot of Nicaraguans. That's maybe more in Indianapolis than here. Our Haitian population has grown. I would say those are the biggest. Our Mexican population is probably the largest population of non-citizens that we represent. Art.
We were away for 18 years,
No.
but before we left, ICE would be raiding local businesses. Are they still doing that?
We don't see that under this administration. We saw it under the Trump administration. I think, that's one of the things as we sort of contemplate what's going to happen in November. We're doing scenario planning. We're starting to talk at NIJC and among other organizations. What are the preventative or the precautionary measures that we can help the community take to avoid that? I do think this is the Trump campaign has released sort of their playbook for immigration, and front and center in that is increased community enforcement. So that expedited removal process that I was talking about at the beginning, right now so that was created in 1996 in a piece of legislation, and it's only been applied along the southern border thus far. Statutorily, they can do that nationwide. And it legally would be pretty hard to challenge their ability to expand that ability to summarily deport someone without them ever having the opportunity to go before an immigration judge. They could expand that, and that would be a mechanism through which that we could see a lot of people that live in our communities that can't prove that they've been in the United States for X amount of time. If they don't have papers, which by definition, they oftentimes don't have papers, they could face deportation, and it could be that summary kind of deportation and expedited removal. That could be really problematic. So we're very concerned.
Where does the funding, less than 500,000 come from?
Well, so here in Indiana, shockingly, we don't get a lot of public funding from the state and the city. Thank you. In Illinois, a lot of the work that we do is funded by the state and is funded by the city of Chicago. So we rely for our Indiana operations, we rely very heavily on our private donations, on foundations. This Tuesday, we're having our Human Rights Awards luncheon. That'll be a big opportunity for us to figure out if we can keep the lights on and keep things going. So that is an ongoing, my fundraiser hat. It's not my favorite hat of the hats that I wear, but that's one of the things that we do to try and keep things going. All right. Well, so let's talk a little bit about what you all are seeing in the news. These I just pulled from the last week or so, and I intentionally, I didn't go to Fox News. I didn't go to the really inflammatory usual suspects, but I think it's so interesting to look at where the conversation on immigration has gone, even in mainstream or left-leaning media. So, for example, there was an article that came out in the Atlantic this week that I thought was fascinating that makes the point that if you just step back dispassionately and look at the economics of immigration, it's the right thing to do, whether your drivers are economic or moral or your faith or human rights based. It makes sense for us to expand immigration. We don't need to be, operating from this notion of scarcity. But the article then, in a very depressing turn, is like, but we're never going to convince people of that. It's too powerful of a narrative tool. And I found that too when I have these, you all are a very friendly group, which is great. I don't always speak with friendly groups. And when we've talked about some of these other dynamics, there's really very little space for a sort of practical, pragmatic discussion about immigration right now. And that's where I think you all come in. I don't have the answer for how we change that narrative. And I think it's a really significant challenge that's before us. But that's one of the pieces out there. The New York Times, David Leonhardt had a piece in there really misrepresenting what the Biden administration has done. Now, I'm not going to defend the Biden administration's work on immigration because I feel like they've been a real disappointment. I also don't think that we're choosing between the lesser of two evils in November. I think the Biden administration is absolutely a more human rights focused, a better administration for immigration and probably most other issues that you want to raise. But I think a lot of the discussion around that has really, this notion that Biden has like opened the borders. David Leonhardt says that President Biden has allowed people who fear Central American gangs to seek asylum, and that's a new and different thing. And Rob's here, and how long have I been asking you for expert affidavits on Central American asylum cases? For like 20 years, right? So this is not a new thing, but the fact that there's this notion that the asylum system has been converted into this open doors policy, I think is really problematic and worrisome. And I think it used to be that asylum was sort of the one area of immigration law where most people agreed we should help people who are persecuted. We should help people escape harm. Those conversations aren't happening the same way now. More often it's like, well, aren't so many of these people committing fraud? Aren't so many of these people exploiting the system? I can tell you that among the asylum seekers that we have contact with, which is many, that doesn't bear out. Yes, there are people who we consult with who we say, hey, what happened to you is awful and sad and terrible, and I'm so sorry, and I understand why you needed to leave your country. That's not an asylum case. I'm not seeing people come trying to commit fraud on the system, trying to exploit the system. And we do a lot of work since summer of, when did the buses start arriving in Chicago? It was like September 1st, 2022. One of the projects that I work with on NIJC is receiving all of those buses that are coming up from Texas to Chicago. And we do a lot of work with those individuals, screening their cases, helping them apply for asylum, helping them keep their cases moving in the right direction, and helping them make informed decisions about how they want to proceed with their cases. Among those people, we are seeing a very high number who are presenting legally cognizable asylum claims. These are not people, who are coming for purely economic reasons. That's a part of it for sure. But there are many people among the people who are arriving who are presenting the types of protection-based claims that we ought to consider for asylum. So does anyone have questions about any of that? All right. The two other things are sort of like forthcoming, like new elements of the parade of horribles that we're seeing. So the Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security released a statement this week that they are expanding efforts to, when they say dismantle human smuggling operations, what they mean is they want to criminally prosecute non-citizens for entering the United States without documentation. So there are two parts of the federal code known as 1325 and 1326 that are sections of the law that allows the United States, the U.S. attorneys, to prosecute people for entering the United States without documentation. Under the Trump administration, 1325 and 1326 prosecutions were the justifications for family separation. So when they started their zero tolerance policy in about 2017, 2018, what they were doing was arresting families as they arrived, telling the parents, okay, we're now going to prosecute you criminally. So we're not going to put you in the civil immigration system. We're going to prosecute you criminally. And because you're going into U.S. Marshals custody, you can't keep your children with you. And so that was the legal justification. That was the basis for family separation. The fact that the Biden administration is saying, you know what, that those 1325, 1326 prosecutions maybe aren't such a bad idea. Like that tells us a lot about sort of where their thinking is. Now, they're not contemplating family separation as far as we know, but they're back to flirting with the precursors of it, which is really concerning. So we put out a statement against this, and a lot of organizations are trying to push back against the increased criminal prosecution of non-citizens for entering the United States without proper documentation. But that's a trend we're going to start seeing. And then watch the news this week. The AP was reporting, and many outlets are reporting, that the Biden administration probably intends to invoke a part of our immigration status that they claim allows them to shut the border altogether. So if you recall, last time we were here, I think we were talking about Title 42, which was under the Trump administration and into the first years of the Biden administration. The government was using a health law called Title 42 to stop anyone from coming across the border. So not allowing anyone to even have those credible fear interviews, just saying, because we were in a health crisis, nobody can come into the United States. Well, Title 42 ultimately was rescinded, and maybe there's consensus that, hey, it never made sense in the first place to use a health law to enforce immigration law. But they found another section of the law that sort of suggests that, well, they're saying suggests that in a time of crisis, the president can unilaterally stop any admissions at the border when it's in the national interest. And so we are very concerned that in the next week or so, they will be invoking that law to try and further limit access to our immigration system and to our asylum systems. So Del told me to bring you some uplifting news, and I fear I'm failing at that part of the assignment. But those are the sorts of things that are percolating in the system that we expect to roll out in the coming days and weeks nationally. Does anyone want to talk about any of those things before we move on?
I have a question.
Sure, Len.
Oh, hold on.
What portion of people coming across the border have some kind of documentation as to people who don't have any at all? You hear occasionally that people get rid of all their identification when they hit the border. Is that true?
So I think there are maybe like two sides to your question. One is like, what portion have like authorization or permission to enter the United States? You know, you may have heard about the CBP One app, which is a phone app that for the last year or two has been available for people to schedule an appointment to present themselves at the border in order to come into the United States, presumably to seek asylum. So there are a number of people who are getting those appointments. There are many, many more who don't have a cell phone, who aren't able to use the app, who aren't able to get appointments, who aren't safe remaining in northern Mexico waiting to get one of those appointments to come in. But there is a portion of people who are coming in with that permission, and those people are often being given what's called parole, which is temporary permission to come into the United States. It's not immigration status. It's not a path to immigration status, but it's a temporary permission to be in the United States. So there's some segment of people entering.
Temporary is how long?
Usually 2 years.
Okay.
It was a lot shorter for a while. There was a lot of advocacy to push it up to 2 years. But we were seeing people get 60 days of parole when they came into the United States, which means, you know, that it's essentially the same thing as being entirely undocumented. Of the people who are entering without inspection or entering through a port of entry but without any sort of documentation, I think that number is quite a bit higher than the number of people who are coming in with documents. In terms of people having their own documentation of identity and other sorts of things, I think that's a real mixed bag. I think people sort of understand that they're going to need to establish their identity. So we see a lot of people with some basic forms, but also, you know, if they've been traveling up through South America, through the Darien Gap, up through Mexico, a lot of people get robbed, kidnapped, held hostage in Mexico where they'll lose their cell phones, their documentation. That's extremely common.
Have you worked with people who have come in and not come in contact with any immigration people at all? They've snuck across the border.
Yeah, previously there was a rather high number of people that never had contact with immigration officials at the border. I'd say in recent years, that's very, very few. Like I can probably count on one hand the number of people we met who haven't been apprehended at the border. Like, you know, this notion that we need a wall or we need to seal the border, or we have open borders. It just doesn't match the reality of how militarized the border is and the extent to which most people are getting stopped. Many of the asylum seekers that we see are trying to turn themselves in upon arrival. But even if someone is trying to evade immigration, that they're
Okay.
rarely successful.
Okay. Now I have one other question,
Yes.
which I don't even know how to ask. It's, are we at a point? I mean, we need people in this country. There's no question about that. So we need immigrants. Are we at a point in this country that we can no longer control it? So many people are coming that there isn't any system that we have in place that will handle these people.
I think
Where does your organization see us on a scale from just one end opening the doors, everybody come, and we'll somehow, sometime figure out who you are and give you documentation,
right.
to the other end locking the door and saying no?
No. Okay. So we can totally do this. This like whole notion or this narrative of like complete chaos. There's nothing we can do about this.
Well, that would be fixed.
I mean, that I don't know. That again is where you all come in talking to your people and, you know, leaning on your levers of power and getting our lawmakers to do the right thing. But absolutely not. I mean, this notion that is complete, like, you know, chaos that could never be managed. Look, there are a lot of things that they could do at the border right now. We put out a white paper with like 10 humane things the Biden administration could do to help the border. One of the things they could do is really tap into the incredible resources of civil society on the border. There are amazing organizations that do humanitarian work, that welcome people, that help people move forward with their cases. My sense is that most of the people I encounter are not trying to avoid the immigration system, but rather are trying to have their day in court and present their case to an adjudicator that can determine whether or not they can access protection. Our immigration courts right now in Chicago, I mean, right now we have an almost 200,000 case backlog in Chicago, which means when I'm trying to get my cases to go forward, you know, it's awfully difficult to get a judge to hear our cases. So again, this whole narrative of like, oh, people are just applying for asylum because they know then they can hang out indefinitely. That's not because that's what they want in most instances. That's because our courts have been so poorly managed and have been so politicized. This last week I was in Chicago and I was meeting with the chief immigration judge. And I was telling her, look, like I've got this great idea, like we're going to work up all of these cases and then we'll bring them to you and you can just have a docket where you can slot us in. Anytime you have an opening, like you can take our cases and we'll go forward, like just give me like 3 days notice and we'll be good to go to trial. And she was like, that's just absolutely not going to be able to happen because as of a few weeks ago, the orders come down from the White House that now they have to prioritize these recent arrival cases. So anybody that's come to the United States within the last year or two will have a court date within 6 months if they're a single adult. But what that means is everybody that's already, all of my cases that have these trial dates coming up are going to get kicked to allow for these other cases to go forward, which means more and more people are languishing in the system. Another thing that's really dysfunctional about our immigration court system is I can't call up my opposing counsel the way you would in any other functioning judicial system and negotiate a case and say, here, I've given you 300 pages of documentation. Let's sit down and talk about this case. Let's see if we can resolve it without going to trial before the immigration judge. And that sort of interaction just simply doesn't happen in immigration court. And it's something that they could do, that the government could decide to do, but they elect not to do. That leaves cases in limbo for far too long. All right. Other questions?
Lisa, how do you disengage from 24/7 work?
Well, Dell talked to you about my family. I've got some kids and a spouse I need to spend time with. I mean, this is what I've been doing for 20 years. You kind of figure out how to strike the balance and do the work, and it ebbs and flows. And sometimes there are late nights and busy weekends, but not always. I think it's you just kind of build up the ability to disengage from time to time and hopefully come back to it more energized and stronger.
I think it is helpful for our congregation to hear this, because this is why the 11:30 service is so important. It's not just language, it's safety. And they gather together with other people who don't have documents, or we don't even know who has documents and who doesn't, but they're scared. I mean, the trauma of the process is huge. And so the 11:30 service is a safe place for them. And I think that's important for us to remember.
For sure. And I think all of the things that this community does to support immigrant populations in some really innovative ways, like none of those are small things. And that's one of the reasons why, like, we love having our office in Goshen. I love doing, part of the reason why the work is sustainable is because we do it in a community where we're supported. And that makes a huge difference.
Lisa, we've been talking a lot about the border, and I've been telling my students for a while, and my data might be old, but at least a few years ago, I think it was something like only 50% of undocumented people in the United States crossed the border, the southern border. The rest came and overstayed their visa and decided to stay, often because the system just is so unworkable. Is that still true, or are we in a different place now with the southern border? And what does that say about the system itself, I guess?
Yeah, I think that probably is true. So people that maybe come on a visitor's visa or a student visa or an employment visa, and then that expires, that is a high portion. I would say that demographic tends to not be the group that we see, because we focus so heavily on lower income people, and sort of if you've managed to find a legal channel to come at the beginning, that tends to be a different population than what we see. Not always. But yeah, I think that is true. And I think that taps into just we're talking about the border, but the fact that we don't have a clear path for young people that we've educated, that have gone to our graduate schools, that want to stay in the United States, that have put down roots, and we don't have clear paths for them to stay. That's just, first of all, it's just a self-inflicted wound, on our own country, but it's pretty outrageous. Under the prior administration, we talked about, the death by 1,000 cuts strategy, where one of the things that was so hard under that administration was just sort of the grinding halt to adjudication of applications. And I think that under this administration, there have been some attempts to try and alleviate at least some of those long adjudication times, but they've not been very successful. So, for example, we do a lot of work with immigrant survivors of crimes that happened in the United States who may be eligible for a visa that's called a U visa. And you can apply for and get, Congress created the U visa back in 2000 so that people who were victims of crimes would come out of the shadows and report those crimes and participate in a prosecution. It was a law enforcement tool. But Congress only allocated 10,000 of those crimes available per year. We've now reached a point where nationwide there are 200,000 U visas pending. So that means it's going to be 20 years before people see an adjudication of that application. And during that time, they don't have employment authorization. They don't have protection against deportation. They don't have the ability to petition for family members that remain abroad from whom they're separated. So it's sort of this tool that was created that's become almost entirely illusory. And that's an easy fix. Congress just lift the cap. But of course, that's just an absolute non-starter. And so that's maybe one example of just sort of the way just structurally our system isn't set up to allow people to access benefits in a humane way or in a reasonable time. Yeah.
What is the mechanism for people wanting to come in for economic reasons? I think there are various kinds of professional and non-professional ways of getting in.
Yeah, there's like this whole world of employment-based immigration, which again is not the space where I have a ton of expertise, but usually in order to, bring in a bright young person that you want to come and work for you, the employer, it's extremely expensive for the employer. They have to do a whole community survey and establish, okay, there's nobody else here who's already got their green card or citizenship that can do this job. You have to do this prevailing wage analysis, and then you pay a lot of money and essentially enter a lottery and hope that your person's visa gets picked to proceed. So there's not a lot of incentive for business owners to go down that path because it's very expensive and very uncertain. And for people that have lived in the United States without documentation who are trying to access those employment-based visas, we've got these awful laws that refer to a thing called unlawful presence, which suggests if you live in the United States for a period of time without documentation, you're penalized and often unable to regularize your status. So that comes into play in family-based situations where many of us know people where, a United States citizen married someone who was undocumented. If that undocumented person had been living in the United States for many years without status, it's not as simple as just filing a family petition and getting that person their green card and keeping this family together. Oftentimes, it's the risk of going back to your home country, to the U.S. consulate to pick up your visa and getting trapped outside the United States for 10 years or even permanently because of those unlawful presence bars. So that's another one of those things, if in a world where I get to tell Congress, what are the fixes we need you to make, unlawful presence, U visa caps, some of that expedited removal stuff, these are the tweaks that we need made to our laws in order for them to be more humane and workable and reasonable. Yeah. I'm curious.
In your experience, are there any states in the country that on helping people find a way to, or is there any
Yeah, it's a really good question.
or innovative being done by any of the states?
Yeah, so the question is whether there are any states that have figured out a way to be more welcoming and more protective of immigrants in their midst. The problem is that immigration law is federal. And so states don't, and we've been Illinois to their credit. So it's so interesting that NAJC is based in Chicago and we have our office here in Indiana, because we have these two states side by side, blue state, Illinois, super red state, Indiana. And though, you know, in Illinois, there's a driver's permit for undocumented people. In Indiana, we see many of our clients get placed in immigration detention and removal proceedings for what? Driving without a license, right? There are these steps that states can make in order to make life more livable and more safe for people. But things like issuing a driver or issuing employment authorization, you know, it's really so ultimately the answer is no. A state can't authorize undocumented people to work. California was trying something, and I think it kind of got hung up. Like, they came up with a whole interpretation through their university system of a way that undocumented people could be issued employment through the state that they believe didn't run afoul of federal law. But that was a really sort of like unique and interesting interpretation that I think a lot of states would be really reluctant to undertake. But look, in Illinois, if you are an asylum seeker, you can get some public benefits. So you can get health insurance in Illinois if you can establish that you're an asylum seeker. Indiana, until very recently, was the only state in the union that didn't allow WIC benefits to undocumented people. That was shameful. And that was just changed within the last year or so due to a ton of advocacy by groups in Indiana. So absolutely, there are things that, like driver's permits, insurance. You know, Chicago has taken a lot of steps to try to limit information sharing with ICE. That's part of the reason why Chicago has been a target of red state governors who are sending buses to Chicago of migrants. But yeah, those are the things that I think have made a difference.
I mean, that's
right.
the irony, you know,
Right.
Our country needs to have, you know, the unemployment issue is real. And so I thought I had heard, I'm from New York, and in New York, I thought there was something maybe at the state or city level that was allowing Venezuelans in particular to have working. Does that ring a bell at all?
So if someone came in, so this, it wasn't the city or the state itself allowing employment authorization, but for example, for Venezuelans, if they had that parole, or for anybody, if they came in with that parole at the border, so if they use that CBP One app, then they can get employment authorization based on that parole status. But remember, that parole status is only good for 2 years. Government doesn't renew parole. So you can get employment authorization for 2 years, then you're done. The other thing that happened for Venezuelans is on July 30 of last year, the government, or the executive, Biden administration, designated Venezuela for temporary protected status. So this is, or TPS. So this is an immigration protection that's available to nationals from Venezuela, through which they can get employment authorization. Haiti has also been designated for TPS, but you have to have arrived in the United States if you're Haitian by November of 2022. So there's always a cutoff date before which you have to have arrived in the United States in order to tap into those benefits. So TPS for Venezuelans was great, but for everyone who's arrived since July 30th, it's not an option. It's not available to them. Other questions? Okay, we can talk a little bit about the local issues. I think we've hit on most of these. The busing to Chicago. Chicago has seen at this point, I think, 40,000 additional southern border arrivals that the city is working to welcome and support. We're seeing some of those recently arrived, largely Venezuelans, Ecuadorians, Colombians, make their way to Indiana. But again, I said that the vast majority are in the Chicago area. We talked about this recent arrivals docket at the Chicago Immigration Court. Family Expedited Removal Management, or FIRM. This is a project by which the government does those really rapid, credible fear interviews that we talked about in the expedited removal context, but applies it to families. So Chicago is one of the designated cities where families that very recently arrived are given an appointment within days of when they arrive in Chicago to go in and have that credible fear interview. And there's no time for them to find an attorney or even, you know, really recover from their journey in any way before they're suddenly tasked with presenting their case before an immigration officer and failure to pass that interview means you're being staged for removal, usually within days. So all of those families are on, usually they designate a head of household and they put that person on an ankle shackle or an ankle monitor. So they're closely monitored. And if they fail to show up for their interview, fail to pass that interview, they're given an appointment for deportation. If they don't show up for that deportation, then ICE is going out and using the tracking device to find the family and remove them. So we're seeing a lot of that in Chicago. We expect they've been talking about opening an immigration court in Indianapolis for years now, but the judge that I spoke with last week assured me it's going to happen in November now. So that'll be a bit of a mixed bag. Having more immigration judges hopefully alleviates some of the strain on the system and hopefully allows us to move some cases forward that have been stagnated for a long time. But we'll see what kind of judges they hire and sort of what the culture is of the Indianapolis court once they initiate that. And then the last thing I wanted to flag was just sort of what we've seen are these tensions between established immigrant populations and more recently arrived immigrant populations. And that's really poignant in Chicago, where there has been this mass mobilization to respond to the people who are arriving by bus, which is great, helping them apply for TPS if they're eligible, helping them apply for employment authorization, helping them apply for asylum, because you have to apply for asylum within 1 year of when you get to the United States. So the community has really mobilized to do a lot of that work. Meanwhile, you have many, many long-term undocumented community members who are saying, what about us? What about TPS for us? What about parole for us? What about employment authorization for us and protection and you know, all of these government entities, you know, dedicating resources to support these communities. So that's been a really complicated conversation. And I hear it in our community here as well, where we do have many people that have figured out how to live to the extent possible for years without documentation. And then we have people who continue to arrive and sometimes they're eligible for different sorts of benefits and protections. And that's a really complicated dynamic that we try to navigate. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much. You have to be one of the angels of the world.
You can ask these two who had to raise me.
Well, there are so many good facts about immigrants. They're going to add $7 trillion to the economy in the next 10 years, another trillion to our tax revenues. There's someone, I don't remember his name, who's written a book called 1 Billion Americans. The book is in the Goshen Library. And one of his major points is that we need 1 billion Americans because of China, to be a counterweight to China.
Yeah.
But even if we had 1 billion, and which is, I think, a slightly ridiculous number, even if we had 1 billion population, we would still have half the population density of Germany. That's how much space we have.
I haven't heard
for immigrants.
Yeah.
And they bring so much to the country.
But how do we, and maybe this is the question for you, like, how do we get back to that conversation? Because that was that article that I was describing to you. Like, I think I'm not an economist, but like any serious economist looking at this, I think can make those projections and see those numbers. And I've seen, you know, Bush administration people come out and say, yes, we need more immigration. But I don't know how we have a serious conversation. Like, how do we set the vitriol aside and have that conversation? And I see Alan nodding his head. You do a lot of work like across different divides. Like, I'm just curious if people have ideas about how we go about doing this, because it's really hard.
Questions? Well, to inform our conversation on these matters, what countries are doing it better?
I mean, there are a number who were that are kind of slipping. I mean, I think a lot of countries are having the same conversation. You know, Canada has become more restrictive in the last 2 or 3 years. But I will say, like we've had a decent number of clients who were held in immigration detention in the United States and then were released, and instead of trying to stay here and fight their case, made their way to Canada. And I can tell you that those people were given housing, they were given support, they had employment authorization immediately. Now, you know, it's a very different dynamic having the US as your southern border, you know, neighbor versus Mexico. Like we certainly have much higher numbers coming into the United States. So maybe that's not a fair comparison. But I will say that Canada seems to have structures that are intended to treat people far more humanely when they're going through their process. How are we doing on time? Could we keep going?
5 more minutes.
Okay. Where do you all want to go? Any questions?
Fun.
Do you know what happened to the families that were separated during the previous administration?
That's a really good question. So, and very like nice segue to the slide. So my last bullet here is this Ms. L separated family project. So during family separation, where NIJC really focused was on separated families where there were a group of mothers in Laredo, Texas, who were alleged to be themselves gang affiliated or criminally affiliated in every one of those cases that I worked on, and there were dozens. These were all women who had been themselves the victims of gang violence, horrible gender violence, and they had escaped, and there had been improper information sharing between their home country and the United States that led to them being separated from their children initially. And then even after this case called the Ms. L litigation that unfolded in the Southern District of California ended family separation. So a judge there in the summer of 2018 said, no, U.S. government, you can't do this family separation. You can't continue to do these 1325, 136 prosecutions and separate families. And so there was an effort to reunify that was completely chaotic and disorganized because they hadn't done any tracking of where they were sending the kids and where they were sending the parents. But for particularly these mothers in Laredo, the government was saying, even though we have been ordered to reunify families, we're not going to reunify you because we think you're affiliated with a Central American gang. And so I'm still today, like, litigating those cases. We managed to get most of those women out of detention eventually. One of them, I was just reminiscing with our director of policy. It was January of 2021, the new Biden administration. We were on the phone with the ICE chief of staff saying, you still have a separated mom in jail. You need to release her. You need to do the right thing here. So those cases, many are still working their way through the immigration system. Of the Laredo moms that we worked with, all of them had what I believe to be very strong asylum cases. A few of them we've won. More of them we had to fight in Texas, in the Fifth Circuit. So I talked about our Seventh Circuit litigation here and our good asylum law in the Seventh Circuit. The Fifth Circuit is a terrible place to litigate asylum. So we've had to fight a lot of denials in those cases before we can eventually get protection for those women. So the short answer is, at this point, most of those families have been reunified. Many of them are still facing deportation, and many of those cases are still at different levels of appeal. This Ms. L separated family project, as a part of the settlement agreement in that litigation. So that litigation finally, so this was the ACLU's litigation against the federal government. It finally resolved in December of last year, where the judge approved a settlement agreement between the parties ending the litigation. And part of that settlement agreement was that the government would provide some kind of access to legal services for any of the Ms. L class members. So we are now one of the legal service providers that are a part of that settlement agreement, which means we will for the next year have some resources to provide legal orientation and support to class members, but not full representation. So the government has taken the most narrow reading of that settlement and said, you can tell people about their rights, you can show them what applications they need to submit, but you can't be the lawyers in court for those people. We're not going to fund full representation. We're going to fund basically these orientation programs. So that's pretty disappointing. We still think it's better than nothing, and we think it'll be a useful tool to hopefully reach some of those families that are still working their way through the system.
How did you work with the fifth district?
Yeah. I had years. How did we work in the Fifth Circuit? Our litigation director. So I'm our legal services director. So I'm not the federal litigation final decider at my organization. And she said to me the other day, like, you really fought me on this. And we ended up litigating in the Fifth Circuit in part because nobody was. And so kind of what we view as a victory in the Fifth Circuit is if we can get a case like remanded. So we're trying to do all sorts of, this gets into like advanced litigation, which is super fun. But sometimes you go to court and you're just trying to like full on win your case, get a published decision, and like, you know, show the world that your client is right and you're vindicated. Sometimes when we're litigating, we're playing for a remand. We're trying to get into mediation. We're trying to find alternative paths to protection for our clients. So what we've done in the Fifth Circuit, some of our cases we've outright won, which was awesome. In one of our cases, they published a great decision, and then they, a few weeks later, unpublished it because I think they realized what they had done. So our client still won, but because the decision wasn't published, it doesn't help other people in the way we would have hoped. But that was really telling. But in many of our other cases, we've just litigated and worked with the government, and I guess probably worn them down in some places to the point where they agree to remand our case, reopen it in the immigration system, and let us fight it out in the lower courts instead of continuing at the Fifth Circuit.
You have to go to Texas.
We work with pro bono. So for the Laredo moms, when I went to Texas quite a bit to work on those cases. For the Fifth Circuit cases, we often partner with big law firms that really like to argue these cases. And so we're counsel, but the attorney who actually argued some of our cases is a law firm partner from Barnes and Thornburg in South Bend. Have I run out the clock?
I think that's question to run you out, but one more question, Chris.
Well, I'll be glad to take one more. It's a statement, really, Lisa. Is that I'm impressed that you are holding up before us the story of our nation, the story of immigration. You're holding up that story, but we are being bombarded constantly with the counter story. And that counter story is such a devastation that's going on continually with our government and leading us to believe that we're being invaded by evil people and robbers and all the rest. And here we have an hour that you uphold to us the story. And I really commend you. But you know, the problem is that the counter story is always more attractive. And we are bombarded with that all the time. And your story, the story that you're giving us, and really the story of who we are as a people, is a story that we need what you're doing and the people that are coming into our nation.